The sun in the Arizona Territory of 1868 was not a giver of life. It was a hammer, a smelter's fire that beat down on the cracked earth until the very air shimmered with malice. For 3 days, it had been Eleanor Hayes' only constant companion, a silent, unblinking eye in a bleached white sky. Her other companion, quieter still, lay under a small mound of stones and a crude cross she had fashioned from the splintered wood of a broken crate. Thomas Hayes, beloved husband. The words were a lie, not the beloved part that was an ache so deep it felt like a physical part of her, but the rest. He was not beloved by this land. He was consumed by it, another forgotten morsel for a ravenous emptiness. Eleanor was 27. A daughter of the rolling green hills of Missouri, and she was as out of place here as a songbird in a slaughterhouse. The dust, fine as flour, had worked its way into everything: the seams of her worn calico dress, the lines around her eyes, the dry, rasping bellows of her lungs. She was a study in browns and grays, almost one with the landscape she was dying in. The wagon train was a distant memory now, a ghost of canvas and creaking wheels swallowed by the horizon. The flux, they'd called it, a vicious, wasting sickness that had torn through their party like a brush fire. It had taken 3 children, an old man, and then it had taken Thomas. He'd wasted away in her arms, his strong farmer's hands becoming bird-like claws, his voice a dry whisper of promises he could no longer keep, promises of California, of an orange grove and a little house that smelled of the sea. The wagon master, a man named Peters with a face like dried leather, had stood over Thomas's fresh grave, his hat in his hands and pity warring with fear in his eyes. "Ma'am," he'd said, not quite meeting her gaze, "we can't risk it. The sickness, it might be on you too. We have to think of the others, the children." She hadn't begged. The pride of her people, stiff-necked Missouri farmers who bent for no man and only for God, was too ingrained. She had simply stared at him, her grief a cold, hard stone in her gut, and watched them pack up, watched them roll out, leaving her with a sack of cornmeal, a near-empty water skin, and the vast, profound silence of the desert. They had left her to die, cloaking their fear in the guise of communal preservation. The first day had been one of numb disbelief. She'd sat by the grave, talking to Thomas as if he might answer, her voice small against the immense quiet. She spoke of their farm, of the day he'd asked her father for her hand, of the ridiculous, hopeful dream that had led them here. By midday, the sun had baked the words from her throat. The second day, the thirst began. It was a living thing, a predator that stalked her thoughts. Her tongue felt thick and swollen in her mouth. She licked her cracked lips and tasted only grit. The cornmeal was useless without water to cook it. She thought of the cool, clear streams of Missouri, of sinking her hands into the dark, damp earth. And the memories were a special kind of torture. She crawled under the meager shade of the lone, skeletal cottonwood that stood sentinel over the grave, its leafless branches clawing at the sky. It was as dead as her husband, and she felt a kinship with its barrenness. She was a dry reed, ready to snap. Now, on the third day, the world had begun to dissolve at the edges. The heat was a constant, shimmering veil between her and reality. She saw things a shimmer of water on the horizon that vanished when she blinked. The phantom shape of a wagon lumbering toward her. Her mind, starved and dehydrated, was offering up ghosts. Death, she thought with a strange, detached clarity, was not a sudden blow, but a slow, quiet, unraveling. She had stopped swatting at the flies that landed on her face. She had stopped listening for the sound of rescuers. She had simply begun to wait. The sun was finally relenting, bleeding across the western sky in hues of orange and bruised purple, when she saw him. At first, she was certain he was another mirage, a trick of the fading light. He stood on a low rise, a silhouette against the dying sun, as still and natural as one of the saguaros that dotted the landscape. He wasn't a product of her fevered imagination. He was real. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her apathy. It was an instinctive reaction drilled into her by 100 campfire stories and whispered warnings. Apache. The word itself was a weapon, synonymous with savagery and a godless thirst for violence. She had heard tales of what they did to women, tales that made the quick, clean death she was facing seem like a mercy. She froze, every muscle tensed. She was a rabbit that had just caught the scent of a coyote on the wind. He carried no rifle that she could see, only a bow slung over his shoulder and a knife at his hip. He was tall and lean, his body all hard lines and efficient grace. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest and back bare to the elements, his skin the color of the red earth. His black hair was long, held back by a simple band. He did not move with the swagger of the white men she knew, nor with the weary trudge of the settlers. He moved as if he were part of the land itself, an extension of its wild, silent heart. He watched her for a long moment, his head tilted slightly. She could not see his expression from this distance, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. It was not predatory, not lustful. It was assessing, calm as the dusk that was settling around them. Slowly, without a sound, he began to walk toward her. Each step was deliberate, measured. He made no effort to hide, yet his feet barely disturbed the gravelly soil. The stories screamed in her head. Run, hide, fight. But her body betrayed her. Her legs were water, her arms leaden. Where would she run into the endless, waterless expanse that had already claimed her husband? He stopped about 20 feet from her, close enough now that she could see his face. It was a strong face, with high cheekbones and a firm jaw. It was not the face of a monster. It was the face of a man. And etched in the lines around his eyes was a weariness that looked ancient, a sorrow that resonated with the raw, gaping wound in her own soul. He had seen loss. She knew it as surely as she knew her own name. His eyes, dark and deep, flicked from her face to the grave, then to the empty waterskin lying beside her. He saw it all in a single, sweeping glance: the dead husband, the abandoned woman, the encroaching death. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The only sound was the sigh of a hot wind stirring the dust. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the vast quiet. This was it, the moment her life would end, not with a whimper of thirst, but with the flash of a knife. She braced herself, a final, defiant prayer forming on her lips. Then he spoke. His voice was low and raspy, like stones rubbing together, yet it carried easily in the still air. The English was slightly accented, but clear. "I need fire for my lodge," he said, his eyes as calm and unreadable as the evening sky. "And you need safety. This is trade enough." The words hung in the air, so simple, so practical. They were utterly disarming. He hadn't threatened her. He hadn't leered at her. He had offered her a transaction, a bargain as stark and stripped down as the land they stood on. Fire for safety, life for life. Her mind reeled. Everything she had ever been taught, every prejudice and fear, rose up in a choking wave. To go with him was to abandon her world entirely, to step into the terrifying unknown that she had been warned against her whole life. He was a savage, a heathen. To trust him was madness. But then her gaze fell on Thomas's grave. That world was gone. Its people had left her here. Its rules no longer applied. Her choices had been brutally simplified, boiled down to their most primitive essence. She could die here, clinging to her fear and her prejudices, a dried-out husk of a Missouri farm girl. Or she could accept the trade offered by this stranger, this man who was supposed to be her enemy. She could choose to live. He stood waiting, patient. He did not press her. He did not move closer. He simply allowed the weight of his offer to settle upon her. He was giving her a choice, something she hadn't had since the wagon train rolled away. Eleanor looked at his face, at the profound stillness there. She saw not a savage, but a survivor, a man who understood the harsh arithmetic of this land. He needed something she might possess the knowledge of tending a constant flame, a skill, a presence, and she needed everything he represented: water, food, shelter, a shield against the coming night and the endless days that would follow. Safety. Her throat was a desert. She tried to speak, but only a dry crackle emerged. She swallowed, the motion agonizing. She would not die here. Not like this. Not while a choice, however terrifying, was still in front of her. Slowly, unsteadily, she pushed herself to her feet. The world swayed, and for a moment, she thought she would fall. His eyes watched her, but he made no move to help. This had to be her own strength, her own decision. She gathered what little she had left, a stubborn spark of defiance against the universe that had tried so hard to extinguish her. She gave a single sharp nod. A flicker of something not quite surprise, perhaps just acknowledgement, passed through his eyes. He turned without another word and began to walk back the way he had come. He did not look back to see if she was following. The trade had been offered and accepted. The rest was up to her. Eleanor took one last look at the crude cross, a final, silent farewell to Thomas and the life they had dreamed of. Then, she turned her back on the grave. She took a step, and then another, her worn boots scuffing in the dust, leaving the only world she had ever known behind to follow a stranger into the deepening shadows, where her own world and her own soul would be changed forever. The walk was a silent ordeal. Eleanor followed the straight, steady line of Nietzsche's back, placing her feet where he had placed his, a desperate mimicry of his effortless glide over the broken ground. The sun had set, and the desert was transforming, the heat of the day bleeding out of the earth and into a sky strewn with a breathtaking wilderness of stars. In Missouri, the stars had been a familiar, friendly blanket. Here, they were a cold, distant fire, a reminder of her own insignificance. Her body, ravaged by dehydration and grief, screamed with every step. Her head pounded, and a dizzying weakness threatened to buckle her knees. Yet she pushed on, driven by the simple, primal command of the man ahead of her. He never looked back, but she knew he was aware of her every faltering step. He had set a pace that was slow, but punishingly steady, as if testing the last reserves of her will. For what felt like hours, they moved through a landscape of rock and thorn. Then, the ground began to change. They slipped through a narrow crack in a rock face, a passage so unassuming she would never have found it on her own. It was a door into another world. The air inside the canyon grew cooler, and the faint, sweet scent of damp earth and creosote bush replaced the dry, dusty air of the open desert. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the towering walls of red rock, which seemed to lean in and whisper secrets to the moon. Deeper they went, into the heart of the ravine. Finally, nestled under a sweeping overhang of rock that rendered it nearly invisible from above, was his home. It wasn't the crude shelter of sticks and mud she might have imagined. It was a lodge, a wickiup constructed with a sturdy frame of bent branches, covered in layers of brush and hides. It was low and round, seeming to grow from the earth itself. A thin tendril of smoke, long since dissipated, had left a dark stain on the rock above, the only sign of habitation. It was a place of deep stillness, a sanctuary hidden from the harshness of the world. Time, it seemed, did not move here. It simply was. Nietzsche stopped and turned to her. In the faint moonlight, his face was a mask of shadows. He gestured toward the entrance of the lodge, a simple flap of hide. Then he went to a large clay pot, an olla, resting in the shade. He dipped a gourd into it and held it out to her. Water, Eleanor reached for it with trembling hands, nearly spilling the precious liquid. He steadied her hands with his own. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her. She brought the gourd to her lips and drank. It was the purest, coldest, most life-giving thing she had ever tasted. He let her take 2 small sips, then gently pulled the gourd away. "Slow," he said. It was the first word he had spoken since his offer. She nodded, her throat too raw to form a reply. He let her have another sip a few moments later, then another, a careful, measured rationing that was an act of profound knowledge and care. When he was satisfied, he pointed to the center of the lodge, where a shallow pit was filled with the gray ash of old fires. "Fire," he said, the single word a quiet command. The trade. Her part of the bargain began. The first few days were a blur of exhaustion and clumsy effort. Survival was a language she had to learn from scratch. Back home, fire was a simple matter of a match and dry kindling. Here, it was an art. Nietzsche showed her once how to use the fire drill, a simple stick he spun between his palms, its tip boring into a small piece of wood until a tiny ember was born. He nurtured it into a flame with a patience she found mesmerizing. Then he left the tools for her. Her first attempts were failures. Her hands, soft from a farmer's wife's duties, blistered and bled. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes as the stubborn ember refused to catch. Nietzsche would return from his hunting, his face impassive, and wordlessly restart the fire himself. He never criticized, never offered help beyond that first lesson. He simply created the fire she had failed to. A silent statement that the bargain was yet to be fully met. Finally, on the 4th day, a spark caught. She cupped it in a small bundle of dry grass, blowing on it with a desperate, dizzying hope until a tiny flame flickered to life. The relief that washed over her was so immense it felt like a religious conversion. She fed the small flame with twigs, then larger sticks, guarding it as if it were a newborn child. When Nietzsche returned that evening, carrying 2 rabbits, the fire was burning steadily, casting a warm, dancing light against the lodge walls. He glanced at the fire, then at her, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was more praise than she had received in a year. Life settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and their needs. Eleanor learned to cook the cornmeal into a thick, bland mush over the flames. She learned to skin the rabbits he brought, her stomach turning at first. But the grim necessity of the task soon overrode her squeamishness. He showed her the hidden spring that trickled from the rocks deep in the canyon, and the path to it became her daily pilgrimage. Carrying the heavy olives of water back to the lodge made her muscles ache, but with each trip, she felt a strength returning to her limbs that she thought had died with Thomas. She listened to the sounds of this new world, the sharp, yipping chorus of coyotes in the distance, the mournful call of a night bird, the constant whisper of the wind as it moved through the narrow canyon. These were the sounds of loneliness, but also the sounds of life. Nietzsche remained an enigma. He was a creature of silent discipline. He would be gone before she woke, melting into the pre-dawn shadows, and would return in the evening, sometimes with game, sometimes with nothing but the dust of the trail on his skin. He ate his share of the food she prepared, his movements economical and precise. He never spoke of where he went or what he saw. He would sit by the fire, mending a moccasin or sharpening his knife on a smooth stone, his focus absolute. Yet, in his silence, she began to see his character. He was not unkind. When he saw her struggling to break a thick branch for the fire, he came and snapped it effortlessly over his knee. When he noticed her wincing as she walked on a blistered foot, he returned that evening with a handful of leaves, which he crushed into a poultice that cooled the angry skin. These were small, wordless gestures, but they spoke of an awareness, a quiet sort of compassion that contradicted everything she'd been taught. The red devil of campfire stories was a phantom. The man before her was reserved, methodical, and possessed a profound, intuitive understanding of the world around him. One afternoon, while he was gone, a restless energy drove her to bring some order to the small lodge. It was a sparsely furnished space, with little more than sleeping pelts, cooking pots, and his weapons. As she swept the dirt floor with a makeshift broom of bundled twigs, she noticed a worn parfleche, a rawhide box tucked into a recess in the rock wall. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't had the energy for in weeks, got the better of her. Her fingers fumbled with the ties. Inside, carefully folded, lay the belongings of another life. There was a dress made of soft, tanned doe skin, its yoke and sleeves intricately decorated with tiny, colorful beads in a pattern like desert flowers. It was small, made for a woman more petite than her. Beneath it was a woven basket, its coils so tight and even it felt like a single, solid piece, dyed with the muted reds and blacks of the earth. And at the bottom, resting on a piece of soft buckskin, was the item that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. It was a handprint, a small one, traced onto the leather and filled in with blue pigment. It was the hand of a child. In that instant, Naichi's silence was no longer a mystery. It was a shroud. He hadn't just lost a wife, he had lost a family. The quiet discipline, the deep-seated weariness in his eyes, it was the armor of a man who had seen his entire world burned to the ground. She thought of the stories she'd heard of the cavalry, of the brutal wars that had swept through this territory, leaving nothing but broken treaties and unmarked graves. His family had likely been lost in that conflict, a casualty of the same relentless westward push that had brought her here. She carefully placed everything back in the box and tied it shut. A profound sense of trespass and an even more profound sense of empathy settling over her. She was a widow. He was a widower. They were both ghosts, haunted by the people they had loved. The chasm of race and culture that separated them suddenly seemed less important than the common ground of their grief. That evening, when he returned, she looked at him differently. The fear she had harbored, the deeply ingrained prejudice that whispered warnings in the back of her mind, began to feel like a childish ignorance. How could she fear a man who had so carefully preserved the memory of his wife and child? The savage beast was a lie. The man before her was a human being, hollowed out by loss, who had chosen to answer her desperate need with a quiet, dignified act of mercy. The true shift came during a storm. One night, the wind that usually sighed through the canyon rose to a feral howl. Rain, a rare and violent gift in this arid land, lashed down in silver sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, the sound echoing off the canyon walls until it felt like the mountains themselves were splitting apart. Eleanor, who had weathered Missouri thunderstorms her whole life, found herself trembling. This was a different kind of storm, wilder, more elemental. She huddled by the fire, pulling her thin shawl tighter, feeling utterly exposed. She glanced at Naichi. He sat on the other side of the fire, calmly sharpening an arrowhead, his hands as steady as the rock that sheltered them. The storm did not touch him. He was as much a part of it as the wind and the rain. He looked up, and his eyes met hers across the flames. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He simply held her gaze for a moment, and in that look, there was a profound and unshakable calm. A realization washed over Eleanor, as sudden and powerful as the storm outside. She was safe, here, in a hidden canyon, in the home of a man she had been taught to hate and fear. She was safer than she had ever been in her life. Safer than she had been with the wagon train that had abandoned her. Safer than she had been against the sickness that had stolen her husband. This man, with his silence and his sorrow, was a fortress. The fear didn't vanish entirely, but it changed. It was no longer a fear of him. It was a fear of the world outside this canyon. The world that had created their circumstances. The world that would judge and condemn them both if it ever found them. She was standing on the precipice of a new identity. one she had never chosen but was now beginning to accept. The trade was no longer just about fire and safety. It was becoming an unspoken exchange between two broken souls, a quiet, fragile pact to survive not just the desert, but the crushing weight of what they had both lost. The days bled one into the next, measured not by a calendar but by the slow crawl of shadows across the canyon floor. The oppressive heat of summer gave way to the crisp, clear air of autumn, the rhythm of their life. Once a strange and frightening melody became a familiar, comforting hum. He would rise in the dark, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows, and she would listen to the faint sound of his footsteps fading as he began his hunt. She would then rekindle the embers of the fire, her first and most important task, before making her daily journey to the spring. She learned the heft of the waterola, the specific ache in her shoulders that meant it was full. She learned to grind the cornmeal between two stones, her hands growing calloused and strong. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was a space filled with shared understanding. She knew by the set of his shoulders when he returned whether the hunt had been successful. He knew by the way the fire burned whether her day had been one of peace or frustration. They were two solitary planets who had fallen into a shared, stable orbit, governed by the silent laws of necessity and mutual respect. The first true change, the first thread of a bond woven from something other than survival, began with a lesson. One morning, as she returned from the spring, Nietzsche was there, not yet gone for the day. He stood near the path, looking down at the ground. As she approached, he pointed with his chin at a series of faint impressions in the dust. To her, they were meaningless scuffs. "Coyote," he said, his voice quiet. He knelt, and after a moment's hesitation, she knelt beside him. He traced the shape of the print with his finger. He walks with his claws showing. Dog does the same, but the path is straight. A dog wanders. A coyote has a purpose. He then pointed to a smaller, more delicate track nearby. Fox. He is lighter. He almost dances. Over the next weeks, this became a new part of their routine. He would show her the world through his eyes. He taught her to read the story written on the earth, the deep, cloven hoofprint of a deer, the drag of a lizard's tail, the way a displaced stone could indicate the passage of a man hours earlier. He taught her which plants could be eaten, which roots held water, and which leaves, when crushed, could soothe an insect's bite. He was giving her the gift of his knowledge, the deep, intricate literacy of the land that had been passed down through his people for generations. He was teaching her how to see. Eleanor, in turn, felt a growing need to offer something back. His world was one of textures, scents, and signs. Hers had been a world of words. One evening, after they had eaten, she took a charred stick from the fire and, on the flat surface of a large, smooth stone, she drew a letter. She said, her voice soft in the firelight. He watched her, his dark eyes curious. He did not ask what it was for. He simply observed, his mind open. She drew another, and she said. She continued until she had spelled out his name, Naichi. He looked from the strange symbols on the rock to his own hands, as if seeing a connection he had never imagined. He reached out a long, calloused finger and slowly, carefully, traced the shape of the N. His touch was hesitant, the gesture of a man exploring a foreign and mysterious landscape. Night after night, the lessons continued. She taught him the alphabet, the sounds each symbol made. She used the only book she had, the small, leather-bound Bible that had survived the journey in her satchel. She would point to a word, say it aloud, and he would repeat it, his tongue carefully navigating the unfamiliar shapes of the English sounds. He was a quick study, his mind sharp and retentive. He learned not just the sounds, but the logic behind them. He began to see the patterns, the way the strange marks she made could capture a thought, a name, a story. In this exchange, A profound intimacy grew between them. It was not the intimacy of touch, but of shared vulnerability. He, the master of his world, became a student in hers. She, the helpless woman he had rescued, became a teacher, a purveyor of a different kind of power. They were bridging the vast canyon between their two cultures, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet, patient work of drawing letters in the dirt and deciphering tracks in the sand. In this landscape of survival, in this place that had been born of death and desperation, they began, tentatively, to learn how to be gentle again. A kind of quiet humor bloomed. One day, she was trying to explain the concept of Missouri, drawing a crude map of a land with too much water and too many trees. He listened patiently, then pointed to the east and said, with a completely straight face, "A bad place for hunting." The unexpected dryness of his wit surprised a short, sharp laugh out of her. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was a laugh nonetheless. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth in response. The lodge was no longer just his shelter that she happened to inhabit. It was a shared space. She took a cutting from a wild gourd vine and coaxed it to grow up the side of the entrance, its broad green leaves a startling splash of life against the brown and red of the canyon. He, in turn, built a small, raised rack for her to dry herbs on, a convenience he had never needed but had built simply because he saw that she did. These were the small, unspoken bricks they used to build a new foundation, a place that was beginning to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a destination. The true test of this fragile new world came on a cool, windy evening. Eleanor had been distracted that day, her mind adrift on a sea of memory. She had been thinking of Thomas, of the easy way he would laugh, of the future they had lost. The grief, which had receded to a dull, constant ache, had flared up again. A sudden, sharp pain. Lost in her sorrow, she had neglected her most fundamental duty. The fire had been allowed to dwindle, to shrink, and finally, a sudden gust of wind down the canyon snuffed out the last glowing ember. She realized her failure with a jolt of pure panic. The hearth was cold and gray. Darkness was falling fast, and with it, a deep chill was settling in the canyon. Her part of the bargain, the one simple task he had asked of her, she had failed. A cold dread, colder than the evening air, washed over her. She imagined his return, his silent disappointment, or worse, his anger. Would he see this as a breach of their contract? Would the safety he had offered be withdrawn? She was frantically, uselessly, trying to work the fire drill when she heard his soft footfalls. He entered the lodge, a brace of quail in his hand, and stopped. The space was utterly dark, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the entrance. He looked at the dead fire pit, then at her face a pale oval of shame in the gloom. She braced herself for the rebuke. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. I forgot. The wind. Naichi said nothing. He set the quail down, and then knelt beside her in the darkness. He took the fire drill from her trembling hands. His were steady. Sure. He didn't chide her or even look at her with disappointment. He simply addressed the problem at hand. "Hold the board," he said quietly. She did as he asked, placing the small wooden hearth on the ground and holding it steady with both hands. He set the spindle in the notch and began to work it between his palms, a smooth, accelerating rhythm that was both powerful and effortless. Her role was small, but essential. Her hands, braced against his, kept the foundation firm. The wind was still gusting, making the task nearly impossible. He worked tirelessly, the friction of the wood a faint, whispering sound in the dark. A tiny wisp of smoke appeared, carrying the scent of hot wood. A moment later, a small, precious ember glowed in the notch. "Now," he murmured. He carefully tipped the ember into the small bundle of tinder she had prepared. "Shield it." He cupped his large hands around the tinder, and she instinctively mirrored his action, her smaller hands fitting around his, their fingers interlacing. Together, they formed a small, protected cavern, a pocket of stillness against the wind. He lowered his head and blew, a gentle, steady breath. The ember glowed brighter, then brighter still, until a tiny, hungry flame licked at the edges of the dry grass. They stayed like that for a long moment, their hands joined, their heads bent over the miracle of the new flame, their breath mingling in the cold air. The fire grew, casting a warm, flickering light on their faces. It was a shared creation, a victory won together against the darkness and the wind. He looked at her then, his face inches from hers in the golden light. His dark eyes were soft, holding an expression she had never seen before. "I need fire," he said, his voice a low murmur, the words echoing their very first conversation. He paused, his gaze holding hers. "But maybe it's you who keeps it alive." The words went through her, not as a statement of fact, but as a revelation. He wasn't talking about the embers in the hearth. He was talking about the warmth that now filled the empty spaces of his life. The light that had returned to his solitary home, and for the first time since Thomas had died, for the first time since her world had been reduced to dust and grief. Eleanor Hayes smiled. It was not a large smile. It was a small, hesitant thing, a fragile bloom in a desolate landscape. But it was real. It was a warmth that came from a place deeper than the fire pit, a place she thought had gone cold forever. The fire was no longer just a tool for survival, no longer just her half of a desperate bargain. It was the heart of their home, and in its light, she saw not an Apache warrior and a Missouri widow, but simply a man and a woman, two lonely survivors who, together, had found a way to keep the flame from going out. The sanctuary of the canyon could not last forever. It was a world built for two, a fragile ecosystem of silence and understanding. But the larger world, the one of noise and judgment, had a long memory and a relentless reach. The first sign of its intrusion was not a sound, but a stillness. One late afternoon, as Eleanor was tending to a small pot of rabbit stew over the fire, she saw Naichi, who had been sitting outside the lodge mending a moccasin, suddenly go rigid, his head lifted, his gaze fixed on the canyon mouth miles away. His entire being had become an instrument of perception, listening to something far beyond the range of her own senses. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hushed. He didn't answer immediately. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, his eyes narrowed. "Horses," he said, his voice a low vibration. "Shod horses, many." A cold fist of fear, an emotion she hadn't truly felt in months, clenched in her stomach. Shod horses meant white men, many shod horses meant soldiers. There was no other reason for such a party to be in this desolate stretch of territory. How could they have found this place? The rumor, she realized with a sickening lurch, the ghost of a story, told by some half-seen prospector or trapper, had finally found its way to a military outpost. Naichi moved quickly, but without panic. He slid his bow and quiver of arrows deep into a crevice in the rock wall, hiding them from view. He took his knife from his belt and placed it beside them. He would face them with empty hands. It was a deliberate, calculated choice. He would not give them the excuse of a threat. He was not a warrior preparing for a fight. He was a man preparing to defend his home. He turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. "Stay in the lodge," he said. It was a command, but his tone was laced with something else, a deep, protective concern. "Do not speak." She wanted to argue, to stand with him, but she saw the iron certainty in his expression. To disobey would be to disrespect his knowledge, his strategy for survival. She retreated into the shadows of the wickiup, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peered through a small gap in the brush wall, her view restricted to the clearing in front of the lodge. The sounds came minutes later, just as he had predicted. First, the faint, rhythmic clinking of metal and the creak of saddle leather. Then the heavy tread of horses picking their way through the narrow canyon entrance. The sounds were an obscenity in this quiet place, a violent tearing of the fabric of their peace. 5 men rode into the clearing. 4 were simple cavalry troopers in dusty blue uniforms, their faces young and sunburned, their eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity as they took in the hidden encampment. But it was the man in the lead who made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat, who made the blood drain from her face. He was a sergeant, his rank denoted by the chevrons on his sleeve. He was a powerfully built man with a square jaw, sandy-colored hair, and confident, pale blue eyes. He sat his horse with an easy, proprietary air, as if the entire territory belonged to him. His name was William Crane, and she had once known him in a different lifetime, a different world. He had been a farmhand on a neighboring property in Missouri, a man who had followed her with his eyes at church picnics and town socials, his infatuation as plain and persistent as a summer fly. Thomas had laughed about it. Eleanor had found it unsettling. Crane had enlisted in the army a year before she and Thomas had left, promising to tame the West. It seemed the West had not tamed him. Crane's eyes swept the camp, dismissing Nietzsche as if he were a piece of scenery, and fixed on the entrance to the lodge. "Eleanor," he called out, his voice a confident baritone that was horribly out of place. "Eleanor Hayes, are you in there? It's Sergeant Crane, William Crane. We've come to take you home." Nietzsche stood between the soldiers and the lodge, his body perfectly still, his hands loose at his sides. He was a statue carved from the red rock of the canyon itself, a silent, immovable barrier. Crane finally deigned to acknowledge him. He looked down from his horse, his lip curling with a mixture of contempt and amusement. "Step aside, Buck," he said, his voice hard. "We've no quarrel with you, so long as you give back what isn't yours." Nietzsche did not move. He did not speak. He simply met the sergeant's gaze, his own eyes as deep and unreadable as the night sky. "Eleanor," Crane called again, his voice sharpening with impatience. "For God's sake, woman, come out of there. We know you're alive. A prospector saw you, said you were being held by a savage. We're here to rescue you." The word hung in the air. Rescue. It was a word that belonged to a story she no longer recognized, a story where she was a helpless victim and these men were her righteous saviors. The absurdity of it was so profound, it almost made her want to laugh. She knew she could not hide. To remain silent would be to let them write the story for her. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped out of the lodge into the harsh afternoon light. She blinked, her eyes adjusting. The 5 men stared at her. She was thinner than they remembered, her skin tanned to a golden brown by the sun. Her calico dress was faded and patched, and her feet were clad in soft moccasins Nietzsche had made for her. Her hair was tied back simply, no longer in the neat bun of a farmer's wife. To their eyes, she must have looked half wild herself. Crane's face broke into a broad, triumphant smile. He swung down from his horse. "Eleanor, thank God. We were so worried. When we heard the news your wagon train had passed through Fort Yuma without you, we feared the worst." He took a step toward her, his arms half open. Instinctively, Nietzsche shifted his weight, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that kept him directly between her and the approaching soldier. Crane stopped, his smile faltering as he glared at Nietzsche. "I told you to step aside," he snarled. It was Eleanor who spoke. Her voice was rusty, but clear and steady. "He will not." Crane's attention snapped back to her, his blue eyes filled with confusion. "What, Eleanor? What has this heathen done to you? Has he harmed you? Don't be afraid. You're safe now." "I have been safe for months." "William," she said, using his first name with a deliberate coolness. The confusion on his face deepened, curdling into disbelief. He looked from her calm expression to Nietzsche's impassive one. He could not comprehend the scene before him. It did not fit the neat, orderly narrative in his head. "Eleanor, you're not making sense," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone, as if speaking to a frightened child. "You've been through a terrible ordeal. You're not thinking clearly. This man is an Apache. They are killers. Now, come along. We'll get you back to the fort. Get you a proper meal. A real dress." He gestured around the camp with a sweep of his hand, his disgust plain. "We'll get you away from all this filth." Each word was a stone thrown at the life she had built here. Each syllable was an indictment of the peace she had found. She looked at William Crane, at his clean-shaven, righteous face, at his uniform that represented the law and order of a world that measured a person's worth by the color of their skin. She saw the absolute, unshakable certainty in his eyes, the conviction that he was right and that her reality was a delusion. Then she looked at Nietzsche. He stood unflinching, his silence a more powerful statement than all of Crane's blustering words. He was not looking at the soldiers. He was looking at her, his gaze steady, waiting. He was not telling her what to do, what to say. He was trusting her to make her own choice. He was giving her a freedom that Crane, with all his talk of rescue, could never understand. In that moment, the last vestiges of the old Eleanor Hayes, the frightened widow, the woman governed by the fears and prejudices of her society, fell away like dust. She had been reborn in the fire of the desert, and she would not let this ghost from her past extinguish her flame. She took a step forward, moving out from behind Nietzsche to stand beside him. It was a simple movement, but it was a declaration. She was not his captive. She was his partner. "You speak of safety, William," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength that surprised even herself. "Let me tell you of the safety your world offered me. Your world got my husband killed. Your world, the good, civilized people of my wagon train, left me beside his grave with a handful of cornmeal and an empty water skin. They left me for the sun and the buzzards." Crane flinched, a flicker of shame in his eyes, but his righteousness was a hard shield. "They had to think of the children. Eleanor, it was a terrible choice, but—" "He made a different choice," she cut him off, her voice rising with passion. She gestured toward Nietzsche, who remained as still as stone. "This man, this savage, as you call him, found me when I was 3 days from death. He had no reason to help me. By the laws of your world, I was his enemy. But he saw a person in need, and he offered a trade." "A trade?" Crane scoffed, his face a mask of incredulous anger. "What could you possibly have to trade with him?" Eleanor met his gaze without blinking, her eyes clear and defiant. The entire world seemed to fall silent, waiting for her answer. The troopers on their horses, Nietzsche beside her. The wind in the canyon, all of it held its breath. She had been brought to a crossroads she never knew existed, forced to choose not just between two men, but between two entire worlds. And the choice, she realized, was not difficult at all. It was the simplest, truest thing she had ever known. "You left me to die," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the force of a thunderclap in the small clearing. "He gave me life. That's all the law I need." The words struck Crane like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, rage, humiliation, and a profound, sputtering incomprehension. He could not process her rejection. He could not accept that she would choose this primitive existence with a heathen over the safety and superiority of her own kind. It was an affront to his pride, his worldview, his very identity. "You're a fool," he finally spat, his voice venomous. "He's bewitched you, or maybe you've just gone mad out here. But this isn't over. No decent white woman lives this way. The army will hear of this. We'll be back." He turned on his heel, swung himself back onto his horse with a violent, angry motion, and yanked the reins. "Let's go," he barked at his men. "There's nothing here for us but a woman who's lost her mind." He led his troopers out of the clearing, their horses' hooves churning the dust. They didn't look back. Eleanor stood watching them go. the dust settling around her, until the last sound of their passage had faded away, and the canyon was silent once more. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the raw, terrifying power of her own decision. She had faced down the ghosts of her past and had not flinched. She had spoken her truth. She turned to Naichi. He was looking at her, and for the first time, she saw the full depth of the emotion he kept so carefully shielded. In his eyes, there was a profound respect, a quiet awe, and something else, something deeper and more vulnerable, that made her heart ache. He had seen her, all of her, and he had not looked away. Without a word, he reached out and gently, almost hesitantly, took her hand, his fingers wrapped around hers, his calloused palm warm and strong against her own. It was not a gesture of ownership or of passion. It was a gesture of solidarity, of a shared destiny, in a world that would seek to tear them apart. They had chosen each other, and in the profound quiet of their canyon home, that was the only law that mattered. The silence the soldiers left behind was heavier than any sound. It was a vacuum, pulling at the edges of the small, firelit world Eleanor and Naichi had built. The air, which moments before had been filled with the alien sounds of shod horses and the sharp, angry cadence of William Crane's voice, was now preternaturally still. Only the wind, a low, mournful sigh moving down the canyon, and the soft crackle of the fire remained. They did not speak. There were no words for what had just happened. No language to contain the magnitude of the choice Eleanor had made, or the silent violence of the world's intrusion. They moved through the familiar rituals of the evening as if in a dream. Naichi took the quail he had brought and prepared them with a quiet, methodical focus. Eleanor added wood to the fire, her movements stiff and deliberate, her mind a maelstrom of shock and a strange, fierce calm. They ate in the flickering light, the space between them charged with unspoken thoughts. The confrontation had been a lightning strike, illuminating everything in a harsh, stark flash. It had burned away all pretense, all ambiguity. She had not simply chosen to stay. She had publicly and irrevocably rejected the world of her birth and claimed this man, this life, as her own. And he had stood beside her, a silent bastion, willing to face down the armed representatives of that world with nothing but the force of his own presence. When the meal was finished, Eleanor could not bear the silence any longer. It was a silence of endings, but it needed to become a silence of beginnings. She looked across the fire at Naichi. He was staring into the flames, his profile carved from shadow and light, his face revealing nothing. "Thomas, my husband," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He was a good man, a farmer. His hands were always gentle with the soil. He believed in things. He believed in the promise of California. He used to talk about it at night, McGee, back in Missouri. He would describe the orange trees, how the air would smell of blossoms and the sea. He said we would build a house with a porch that faced the sunset." She paused, the memories washing over her, no longer with the sharp, stabbing pain of fresh grief, but with a soft, aching melancholy. She was entrusting Naichi with these ghosts, offering him the most fragile parts of her past. "He wasn't made for this land," she continued, her gaze distant. "He was a man of green hills and soft rain. The sun here, it broke him before the sickness ever did. He tried to be strong, but this place is too hard for men like him. He dreamed of a garden, and he died in a desert." Naichi remained silent, but he turned his head and looked at her. He was not just hearing her words. He was listening to the sorrow beneath them. His gaze was a deep, quiet pool, and she felt as if he could see all the way to the bottom of her soul. He offered no empty words of comfort, no pity. He simply listened, giving her story the weight and dignity of being heard. After a long moment, when her voice had trailed off into the crackling of the fire, he spoke. His own voice was low, softer than she had ever heard it. My wife's name was Tala, he said. The name fell into the quiet space between them, a sacred thing. It means wolf. She was not named for the animal's teeth, but for its heart. She was loyal to her pack, to our family. Her hands were never still. They were always weaving baskets, or beating moccasins, or tanning a hide. She laughed like the water that runs from the spring after a heavy rain, clear and fast. He looked away from her, back into the fire, as if he could see a phantom there. The soldiers came to our village at dawn. It was a peaceful relocation. They said we were being moved to a reservation, for our own protection. There was a sickness in the camp, a coughing sickness that stole the breath. My Nita, our daughter, she was small. The blue handprint in the box is hers. She was ill. Tala would not leave her side. I was away, hunting. When I returned, the village was gone. The tracks of the wagons were deep. The soldiers, they did not allow the sick to slow them down. They were left behind, the same as your husband. He did not need to say more. The stark, brutal economy of his story painted a picture more vivid than any elaborate tale could. A sick child, a devoted mother, a system that saw them as obstacles to be discarded. His loss was not a single death, but the eradication of his entire world. A world he had returned to find only ashes and silence. They sat there, two survivors from opposing sides of a brutal conflict, their personal tragedies a mirror of one another. The labels of settler and savage dissolved in the heat of the fire, leaving only a man and a woman, both of whom had seen their beloveds consumed by the callous indifference of a world on the move. Their shared grief was a bridge, a profound and sorrowful connection that transcended culture, race, and language. Slowly, Naichi rose. He went to the parfleche box tucked into the wall, the one Eleanor had discovered weeks ago. He brought it back to the fire and knelt, untying the leather straps with reverent hands. He pushed aside the beaded dress and the woven basket, his fingers searching for something at the bottom. He drew out a simple bracelet. It was a single strand of polished turquoise stones, the color of a summer sky, interspersed with small, dark beads of jet. The stones were worn smooth, imbued with the warmth of the person who had worn them. He held it out to her, his hand steady. "Tala made this," he said, his voice thick with memory. "The blue stone is for the sky, for protection. The black is for the earth, for home. She wore it always." He looked from the bracelet to Eleanor, his eyes dark and impossibly deep. "When she was gone, the fire in my lodge went out. My heart was ash. You brought the flame back." He took her hand, his touch sending a tremor through her. "I want this fire to have a keeper again," he said softly. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, blurring the firelight into a shimmering haze. This was not a proposal, not a declaration in the way her old world would have understood it. It was something far deeper. It was an offering of trust, a passing of a sacred torch. He was asking her not to replace the woman he had lost, but to become the new guardian of his home, his heart, his life. She gave a small, trembling nod, unable to speak. With a gentle, careful touch, he fastened the turquoise bracelet around her wrist. The stones were cool against her skin, a tangible link to a life she had never known, and a symbol of the new life she was now choosing. It felt heavy with meaning, a sacred vow made without words. He did not release her hand. His thumb stroked the back of her wrist, a slow, comforting gesture. The space between them, once a vast and silent chasm, had shrunk to nothing. There was only the warmth of the fire, the cool touch of the stones on her skin, and the steady presence of the man before her. He looked at her, his eyes asking a question for which there were no words. The raw vulnerability in his expression mirrored her own. The confrontation with Crane had stripped them both bare, leaving only the essential truth of their connection. Slowly, he raised his other hand and gently touched her face, his calloused fingers brushing a tear from her cheek. His touch was not one of possession, but of reverence. It was the touch of a man who had been starved of gentleness for too long. Eleanor leaned into his hand. A silent, unconditional surrender. It was not a surrender of her will, but of her loneliness, of her fear. In the soft, wavering light of the fire, they came together. It was not a storm of passion, not a sudden, desperate claiming. It was a quiet, inexorable tide, the joining of two shores that had been separated for a lifetime. His mouth found hers, a tender, questing touch that was filled with a sorrow and a hope so profound it made her spirit ache. They moved to the soft sleeping pelts, their bodies fitting together not as strangers, but as two halves of a long-broken thing finally made whole. It was a silent communion, an act of exquisite solace. It was the warmth of a shared blanket in the deep cold of the night, the profound comfort of another heartbeat in the vast, echoing silence of the wilderness. For Eleanor, it was the end of a long and terrifying fall, and the discovery of solid ground beneath her feet. For Naichi, it was the return of warmth to a house that had been cold for an eternity. They were not taking something from each other, but offering a sanctuary, a place of ultimate safety where the ghosts of their past could finally rest. Afterward, they lay together, wrapped in the furs and the quiet intimacy of the firelight. Eleanor lay with her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. The turquoise bracelet was cool against her skin. The world outside the canyon, with its judgments and its armies, seemed a distant, insignificant thing. It could not touch them here. She looked at the dancing flames in the fire pit, the fire she had tended, the fire that had become the anchor of her existence. She looked at the bracelet on her wrist, a symbol of a past she would honor and a future she would protect. She felt the steady rise and fall of Naichi's breathing beneath her cheek. "My world and your world," she whispered into the darkness. "They tried to destroy us both." He stroked her hair, his hand moving with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. "They are just stories now," she said, a quiet certainty blooming in her heart. "This is real. We are real." She lifted her head to look at him, to see the truth of her words reflected in his eyes. "You needed fire for your lodge," she murmured, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "And I needed safety." A slow, gentle smile, the first she had ever truly seen, touched his lips. He gathered her closer, his arms a fortress around her, in the heart of the great, unforgiving desert, between the warring worlds of two peoples. They had found their own territory. It was a small, fragile kingdom, bounded not by maps or treaties, but by the simple, profound truth that had brought them together. Here, in the warm glow of the wickiup, fire and safety had finally become the same thing. The peace they had forged was as fragile as a desert flower. It bloomed in the shelter of the canyon, a vibrant, impossible thing, but it was never meant to withstand the harsh winds of the outside world. For a few precious months, as the seasons turned and the canyon floor was briefly carpeted with the gold of autumn poppies, their life was a quiet rhythm of shared purpose and deepening affection. The world was held at bay. It was in this time of quiet grace that Eleanor realized a new life was growing within her. It was a secret she kept for weeks, a terrifying, wondrous hope that she held close to her heart. It was the ultimate testament to the world they had built. A child conceived not in Missouri or California, but in this hidden pocket of the earth. A child of two worlds, two bloods. When she finally told Naichi, her voice trembling, he did not speak for a long time. He simply placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach, his palm warm and steady. In his eyes, she saw a universe of emotions, the ghost of an old sorrow, the dawn of a new and ferocious joy, and a resolve as hard and unyielding as the canyon rock. A man who had lost a family was being given another, but the ghosts of society were gathering. Naichi grew more watchful, his long journeys into the desert leaving a deeper quiet in their wake. He brought back news, not spoken in words, but written in the tension of his jaw, in the way he scanned the horizon. The blue-coated soldiers were no longer just patrolling. They were sweeping. A brutal, methodical campaign was underway to force the last of the free Apache, his people, onto the reservations at San Carlos and Fort Apache. He spoke the names like a curse. "It is a place to die slowly," he told her one evening, his voice flat and hard. "They promise food that never comes. The water is foul. Sickness spreads like fire in dry grass. A man's spirit is put in a cage until it forgets how to fly." He looked at her, his gaze dropping to her stomach. "My child will not be born in a cage." The decision was made without further discussion. Their sanctuary was no longer a fortress. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. They had to leave. Their destination was the one she had set out for in another lifetime, California. It was no longer a place of orange groves and sea breezes, but a desperate gamble, a name on a map that meant away. They prepared to leave in the pre-dawn darkness, a swift and silent dismantling of their home. They took only what was essential: water, dried meat, cornmeal, Nietzsche's remaining bow and arrows, and the old rifle he had taken from a trapper's abandoned camp years ago. Eleanor packed her small Bible and the worn, folded map of the territories that had belonged to Thomas. The map felt like a relic from a forgotten religion, but it was now their only guide through the white man's world. As she tied the sleeping pelts into a tight roll, her fingers brushed against the smooth turquoise stones of the bracelet on her wrist. It was her only ornament, her only link to the woman who had come before, and a constant reminder of the promise she now carried. Leaving the lodge was like tearing a part of herself away. It had been more than a shelter. It was the place she had been reborn. The journey was a descent into a sun-blasted hell. The desert they had lived beside was now an adversary they had to cross. Nietzsche led them by night, navigating by the stars with an instinct that felt like magic. By day, they would find what little shelter they could, a shallow cave or the shadow of a rock outcropping, and sleep through the worst of the heat, huddled together for shade and security. Eleanor, who had once been a liability in this landscape, was now a vital part of their survival. The lessons Nietzsche had taught her were now put to the ultimate test. She could read the tracks, spot the subtle signs of water, and move with a quiet efficiency that conserved every drop of moisture, every ounce of strength. While he was the master of the wilderness, she was the interpreter of the world they were moving toward. At night, by the light of a tiny, smokeless fire, she would study the map, her finger tracing the thin lines that represented rivers and the faint squares that marked settlements to be avoided. They were a single unit, his ancient knowledge and her learned literacy working in tandem. The threat of the cavalry was a constant presence. Twice, they had to press themselves into the narrowest of crevices as a patrol road passed. The jangle of their gear and the casual cruelty of their laughter a chilling reminder of the world that hunted them. Eleanor held her breath, her hand protectively over her belly, as the blue uniforms passed, so close she could smell the sweat of their horses. In those moments, she understood that her defiance of Sergeant Crane had not been an end, but a beginning. She had declared war on his world, and it would show her no mercy. A week into their journey, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind began to howl, picking up sand and grit until the air itself was a rasping, blinding fog, a sandstorm. Nietzsche pulled her and their pack-horse into the lee of a granite boulder, wrapping a piece of cloth around her face. For hours, the world was reduced to a roaring, suffocating chaos. Sand blasted against the rock, a relentless assault that scoured the landscape and erased all trace of their passage. Eleanor huddled against Nietzsche, his body a solid shield against the storm's fury. This, she thought, was their life now, finding moments of shelter in the midst of a world trying to tear them apart. When the storm finally passed, the world was remade, a landscape of smooth, rolling dunes under a clean-swept sky. They were low on water and food, according to her map. A trading post, run by a man named Silas Croft, lay a day's journey to the north. It was a risk, but one they had to take. "I will go," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "He will see a white woman in need of supplies. You will wait out of sight." Naichi's eyes were filled with dissent, but he knew she was right. His presence would invite danger. It was a bitter reversal, that her white skin, once a mark of her vulnerability, was now their only shield. The trading post was a squalid adobe building, little more than a den in the dust, surrounded by empty whiskey barrels. Silas Croft was a weasel of a man, with watery, shifting eyes and a beard stained with tobacco juice. He looked Eleanor up and down, his gaze lingering on her worn dress and the moccasins on her feet. "Get lost from your people, ma'am?" he asked, a greasy smile on his face. "My husband is a prospector." Eleanor lied, her voice steady. "Our wagon broke an axle a few miles back. I just need flour, salt, and water." He sold her the supplies, his eyes darting toward the desert behind her as if he could sense Naichi's presence. There was a greed in his gaze that set her teeth on edge. As he handed her the heavy sack of flour, he leaned closer. "You know," he said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper, "the Army's paying a handsome bounty for any Apache buck, $50. A man could do a lot with that kind of money." A chill went down Eleanor's spine. She paid him, her face a mask of neutrality, and turned to leave. The weight of the supplies a heavy burden, the weight of his words even heavier. The betrayal came an hour later. They had just made camp in a rocky arroyo when the sound of approaching horses echoed through the dusk. It was Croft, and he had 2 other men with him, rough-looking characters with rifles held loosely in their hands. Well, Croft called out, his voice dripping with false bonhomie as he saw Naichi. "Looks like your prospector husband is a little redder than you let on, ma'am." Naichi moved to stand in front of Eleanor, placing her behind him. He held the old rifle, but he did not raise it. "We have no quarrel with you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "My quarrel's with the $50 in my pocket." Croft sneered. "Just come along peaceable, and the lady don't get hurt. We'll turn you over to the Army, nice and tidy." Eleanor's world narrowed to the space of that arroyo, to the 3 menacing figures and the man who stood as her shield. The time for words, for choices, was over. Naichi knew it, too, with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of motion. He raised the rifle and fired. It wasn't aimed to kill, but to startle, the bullet kicking up dust near Croft's horse. The horse shied violently, and in that split second of chaos, the fight began. One of the other men fired, the shot echoing like a thunderclap. Naichi cried out, a sharp, guttural sound, and staggered back. Clutching his side, the rifle fell from his grasp. Blood, dark and shocking, bloomed between his fingers. Seeing him fall, seeing his blood on the sand, broke something open in Eleanor. A primal, protective fury erupted in her chest, a force of nature more powerful than any sandstorm. These men were not just threatening her, they were threatening her child, her future, the entire world she had fought so hard to claim. Before she was even aware of making a decision, she was moving. Croft's companion was reloading, his attention on the wounded Naichi. Eleanor scooped up a heavy rock from the arroyo floor, its weight familiar and solid in her hand. The man looked up, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw her charging toward him, a wild, fierce cry tearing from her throat. He had expected a cowering woman, not a she-bear defending her den. That hesitation was his undoing. She brought the rock down on the side of his head with all the force of her fear and her rage. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. Croft, recovering his senses, turned his pistol toward her. But Naichi, fighting through the pain, had drawn his knife. He surged forward, not with his usual grace, but with a wounded animal's desperate strength, and drove his shoulder hard into Croft's chest, sending the man sprawling. The pistol discharged, the bullet whining harmlessly into the night sky. The third man, seeing his companions fall, lost his nerve and fled into the darkness. Naichi stood over the gasping trader, his knife at the man's throat, his face a mask of pain and cold fury. But he looked at Eleanor, at the rock still clutched in her hand, at the fierce, protective light in her eyes, and his expression softened. He pulled back, grabbing Croft by the collar and hurling him toward the desert. "Go!" he growled. "Tell your army you were beaten by a woman. They will not believe you." Croft scrambled away, vanishing into the night. The silence that returned was absolute. Eleanor dropped the rock and rushed to Naichi's side. He was leaning heavily against the arroyo wall, his face pale in the moonlight, his hand pressed tight against the wound in his side. "It is not deep," he said, his voice strained. But she could see the lie. Blood was still seeping through his fingers. The roles were now completely reversed. He was the one who was wounded, vulnerable. She was the one who had to be strong. She tore a long strip from her petticoat and pressed it against the wound, her hands moving with a surgeon's desperate focus. "We have to stop the bleeding," she said, her own voice sounding distant and calm. She built a fire, her hands stained with his blood. The fire was no longer just for warmth. It was a tool for survival. She heated the blade of his knife in the flames until it glowed red, her heart pounding with a terrible resolve. He watched her, his eyes clouded with pain but filled with an unwavering trust. This was the true price of their freedom, she realized, as she tended to his wound under the cold, indifferent stars. It was not a price paid in money or land, but in blood and in fire. The life they had built together, the fire in their lodge, was now baptized in the blood he had shed to protect it. She was no longer just a survivor, no longer just a keeper of the flame. She was a fighter, a protector, a woman who had met the violence of the world with a violence of her own, and had won. The cost was high, but the alternative, a world without him, was unthinkable. The rest of the journey was a fever dream, a desperate, stumbling flight toward the promise of a line on a map. Naichi's wound, though cauterized by fire and Eleanor's grim determination, festered. The heat and the relentless pace weakened him, and there were days when Eleanor had to half carry him, her own strength fueled by a fierce, protective love and the stubborn life kicking within her. She was no longer just his companion. She was his anchor, his guide through a world that would see him only as a target. She navigated by the sun and the map, bartering for supplies in dusty, one-street towns with stories of a sick husband, her heart in her throat every time a lawman glanced their way. They crossed the Colorado River by moonlight, paying a ferryman with the last of their money. When they finally stumbled into the greener, more forgiving landscape of Southern California, they were ghosts, stripped of everything but each other. The arid, red rock world of Arizona was behind them, a place of memory, of trauma, and of the profound, violent birth of their love. They found their way to the outskirts of Los Angeles, a burgeoning town that was a chaotic mix of Spanish adobes, new timber frame buildings, and the tents of recent arrivals. It was a place where identities were fluid, where a person's past could be shed as easily as a dusty coat. They settled in a small, forgotten valley a few miles from the town proper, a place where the hills were dotted with live oaks and the air smelled of sage and dust. It was not the profound, sacred isolation of their canyon, but it was a place they could disappear. Here, in this new world, Naichi died and a new man was born. The conversation happened one evening as they sat by a small, cautious fire. The sounds of distant cattle and the faint rumble of the growing town, a constant reminder that they were no longer alone. "My name is a danger here," Naichi said, his voice quiet. He had been looking at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "It is a name for the desert, for the people. Here, it is a brand." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a deep, pragmatic sorrow. "I will need a new one." The choice was a profound sacrifice, an act of self-immolation for the sake of survival. He was cutting himself off from his ancestors, from the very essence of who he was. Eleanor understood this, and her heart ached for him. They talked for hours, discarding names that sounded too Anglo, too out of place. Finally, they settled on one that felt like a plausible camouflage in this land of Spanish heritage. Santos, a name of saints. An irony so bitter it was almost a prayer. And for a first name, something that echoed his own, but was common enough to be forgettable. Nathan. Nathan Santos. He said it aloud, the syllables foreign and clumsy on his tongue. He was no longer Nietzsche, the Apache warrior who could read the story of the land. He was Nathan Santos, a quiet man of uncertain origin, a shadow trying to blend into a new landscape. Life began again, piece by piece. Nathan, who had a connection to animals that transcended language, found work. He had a gift with horses, a quiet, intuitive way of calming the most skittish colt or breaking the most stubborn stallion. He didn't use force or fear, but a deep, patient understanding that horsemen, hardened men who had seen it all, watched with a mixture of suspicion and awe. They didn't know where he came from. Some said Mexico, some said he was a mission Indian, but they knew he had a magic touch. He spoke little, letting his hands and his quiet presence do the talking. The work was hard, but it was honest, and it put food on their table and allowed them to build a small, simple home, a one-room adobe cabin with a packed earth floor and a sturdy roof. 4 months after their arrival, in the cool of a California spring, their daughter was born. She came into the world in their small cabin, with only Nathan's steady hands and Eleanor's exhausted, triumphant love to welcome her. They named her Mary. It was a simple, common name, a shield against curiosity, a name from Eleanor's Bible. But to them, it was a miracle. She was a perfect fusion of their two worlds. She had her father's dark, soulful eyes, his high cheekbones, and his straight, black hair, but her skin was a beautiful, creamy olive, a shade lighter than his, and her smile was all Eleanor's. She was the physical embodiment of their union, a living bridge between the Missouri farm and the hidden canyon. As Mary grew from an infant into a curious, bright-eyed toddler, Eleanor felt a new purpose stirring within her. She saw the other children in their small, hard-scrabble community, the pale, ragged children of white laborers and the dark-eyed children of the local Tongva people and other displaced tribes who lived on the fringes of the town. None of them had access to an education. The world of letters that had been a bridge between her and Nathan was a locked door to them. And so, she opened a school. It was nothing grand. It was simply a blanket spread under a large oak tree behind their cabin. Her students were a handful of poor children, a mix of white, Mexican, and Native American, who sat together, their differences forgotten as they learned the magic of the alphabet. Eleanor taught them to read and write, to do simple arithmetic, but more than that. She taught them a quiet kindness in her small, open-air classroom. There was no hierarchy of race or background. There was only the shared, wondrous struggle of learning. Nathan would sometimes stand at a distance, watching, a rare, soft smile on his face, as he saw his own daughter sitting between a freckle-faced boy with an Irish accent and a shy Tongva girl, all of them tracing letters in the dirt. Their life found a new rhythm, one of quiet domesticity that was a world away from the stark survival of the desert. But they never forgot. The past was not a ghost to be exorcised, but an ancestor to be honored. The most sacred part of their day was the evening, after the work was done and the lessons were over. Every night, no matter how tired they were, Nathan or Nietzsche, as he would always be to her in the privacy of their home, would build a fire in a small stone pit in their yard. It was not a large, roaring blaze, but a small, contained fire, tended with the same care and reverence as the one in their wickiup. Here, they were not Nathan and Eleanor, the horse trainer and the school teacher. Here, they were the man who needed fire and the woman who kept it. They would sit beside it, sometimes talking in low voices, sometimes in a comfortable silence, while Mary played in the flickering light. He would tell her stories of his people, not stories of war and loss, but of Coyote the trickster, of how the stars came to be in the sky, of the language of the birds, and she would read to him from her Bible, not as a lesson, but as a sharing of her own tribe's stories, of David and his courage, of Ruth and her loyalty. Mary grew up in the cradle of these two cultures. She learned the Apache words for the plants that grew in the hills behind their house, and she learned to recite English poetry. She could track a rabbit with her father in the morning and learn to write her name in perfect cursive with her mother in the afternoon. She was a child of two worlds, and she moved between them with an easy, unthinking grace. She was their greatest creation, a testament to the fact that love could build a home where war had only left ashes. Their life was peaceful, but it was a peace tinged with a permanent, underlying sorrow. They were exiles. For Eleanor, it was the loss of her family, her home, the familiar green hills of Missouri. She would sometimes look east, a wistful, faraway expression on her face, and Nathan would know she was thinking of a life she could never reclaim. For him, the loss was deeper, a severing from the very earth that had birthed his people. He could never go back to the red canyons, to the sacred mountains. He was a tree that had been uprooted and replanted in foreign soil. He was alive. He was growing. But his roots would forever ache for the land they had lost. This melancholy was a quiet, constant companion, a ghost that sat with them by the fire. They had found safety. They had found a home, but they had paid for it with their identities. They were living proof that survival often required a kind of death. One evening, when Mary was about 6 years old, she sat between them, her head resting on her father's lap. She was looking into the flames, her dark eyes wide and thoughtful. "Papa," she said, her voice small. "Why do we always build a fire? The other houses have stoves inside." Nathan looked at Eleanor over the top of their daughter's head, a silent, shared glance that contained their entire history. He ran his hand gently over Mary's dark hair. "The fire is important," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A long time ago, I lived in a place where it was very dark. The fire was my only light." He paused, and then looked at Eleanor, his gaze soft and filled with a love that had weathered deserts and bloodshed. "And your mother, she is the one who keeps it from going out. This fire is our home. Little one, it is the story of how we began." Mary accepted this, as children accept the great, simple truths of their world. She looked back into the flames, at the dancing heart of their story. The fire was the fire for his lodge. The fire was the safety she had so desperately needed. And here, in a small yard in California, under a different set of stars, it was a quiet, defiant symbol of a love that had refused to be extinguished. It was a home no war could burn, no army could conquer, no society could erase. The years that followed were not a grand adventure, but something quieter, braver, and far more profound, the slow, deliberate building of a life. The town of Los Angeles grew around their small valley, the distant rumble becoming a steady hum, the dusty tracks hardening into proper roads, but in their small adobe home, under the shade of the ancient oak, Nathan and Eleanor Santos carved out a world that ran on its own time, governed by its own laws of kindness and memory. Nathan never lost his connection to the wild, silent places. Though his hands grew calloused from the leather of reins and the wood of fences, his eyes remained the eyes of a hunter, always seeing the things others missed: the hawk circling on a thermal, the subtle shift in the wind that signaled a change in weather, the fear or trust in a horse's gaze. He became a legend in the horse training community, a quiet, brown-skinned man to whom people brought their most broken and spirited animals. They called his method the Santos way, never understanding that it was not a method at all, but a language, a silent dialogue between two spirits who understood the nature of a cage. He never raised his voice, never used a cruel hand. He simply offered the horses the same thing he had once offered Eleanor, a sense of safety, an assurance that they had found a place where they would not be harmed. Eleanor's school under the oak tree flourished. It became a local institution, a place of radical grace in a world that was hardening along lines of race and class. Her hair, once the color of Missouri cornfields, slowly silvered, and the lines around her eyes deepened. But those eyes never lost their fire, their fierce belief in the power of a shared story. She taught generations of children to read, her students a patchwork quilt of the New West, the children of Irish rail workers, displaced Mexican ranchers, and the native Tongva, whose own language was fading into whispers. In Eleanor's classroom, they were all simply children, their minds hungry for the world she opened up to them. She taught them poetry and history, but the greatest lesson was in the simple fact of their sitting together, a truth that silently defied the growing segregation of the town around them. Mary grew up as the heart of this union, a living testament to its power. She was a bridge, walking between her father's silent, intuitive world and her mother's world of words and books. From him, she learned the names of the stars in the Apache tongue and how to be still enough to hear the heartbeat of the earth. From her, she learned Shakespeare and the Declaration of Independence, understanding instinctively that both contained their own truths, their own forms of power. She faced the casual cruelties of the outside world, the thoughtless slurs from children who saw only her brown skin, the suspicious glances from adults who could not place her. But she was fortified by the unshakable love of her home. When she returned, stung by the world's prejudice, her father would say nothing, simply taking her hand and leading her to the quiet hills. Her mother would hold her close and tell her, "Their world is small, my love. It is built of fences. Our world is built of bridges. It is stronger." The nightly fire was the constant, the ritual that anchored their family. It was where they celebrated small victories and weathered quiet sorrows. It was where Mary brought the young man she would eventually marry, a kind, steady-eyed carpenter who was initially intimidated by her quiet, watchful father, until Nathan saw the goodness in his hands and the respect in his eyes. It was by the fire that they held their grandchildren, Nathan's weathered face cracking into a rare, beautiful smile as a small hand clutched his finger, and Eleanor's voice, now soft and reedy, humming old Missouri lullabies. They grew old together, their love deepening into a quiet, telepathic understanding. They moved in sync, two ancient trees whose roots had grown so entwined beneath the earth that they were a single living thing. He would know, from a shadow that crossed her face, that she was thinking of the brother she had left behind. She would know, from the stillness in his shoulders as he looked toward the eastern mountains, that he was mourning for the red earth of his ancestors. They carried their losses not as burdens, but as a shared history that gave their present peace its profound and precious weight. Eleanor passed first, in the spring, when the hills were alive with wildflowers. She died in her sleep, in the bed she had shared with her husband for over 40 years, a faint, peaceful smile on her lips. The entire community mourned her, men and women who were now grandparents themselves, who had learned their letters on a blanket under her oak tree, came to pay their respects, their faces a testament to the legacy she had built. Nathan was a ship that had lost its anchor. He seemed to drift, his great physical strength finally succumbing to the gravity of his grief. He stopped working with the horses. He would spend his days sitting on the porch, his gaze fixed on the old oak tree, as if he could still see her there. He tended the evening fire by himself, a lonely, silent vigil. Mary and her family stayed with him, their presence a comforting warmth, but they knew a vital part of him had already followed Eleanor. 3 months later, as the summer heat settled over the valley, he joined her. He died on the porch, in his favorite chair, looking east. They buried him beside her, under the spreading branches of the oak. The whole town came to the funeral of the quiet man they knew as Nathan Santos, the horse whisperer, the steadfast husband of their beloved teacher. Only Mary and her children knew that they were also burying Naichi, the last warrior of a hidden canyon, a man who had chosen a new name so his family could live. Mary had a simple stone cut for their grave. It did not bear their names or dates. It bore only 3 words, the truest summary of their lives. The one law by which they had lived and loved: they chose each other. Years passed. The town of Los Angeles swelled into a city, its concrete and noise swallowing the quiet valley. The adobe cabin and the great oak were long gone, replaced by a row of neat suburban houses, but the story lived on. On a warm, golden evening, a much older Mary sat on the porch of her own comfortable home, surrounded by her grandchildren, their faces bright and curious in the fading light. Her hair was a crown of pure white, and her dark eyes, so like her father's, held the deep, gentle wisdom of a long life. On her wrist, she still wore a simple bracelet of turquoise and jet, the stones worn to a silken smoothness by the touch of 3 generations. Her grandson, Samuel, a boy with his great-grandmother's fair hair and his great-grandfather's thoughtful gaze, pointed to the bracelet. "Tell us again, Grandma," he said. "Tell us the story of the fire." Mary smiled, a slow, nostalgic smile. She looked out at the sky, painted with the same bruised purples and soft oranges as a desert sunset, and she began to speak, her voice a soft, melodic murmur. She told them of a desperate woman left to die in the dust, and of a lonely, grieving warrior who appeared in the dusk. She told them of a hidden canyon, of lessons in tracking and reading, of a confrontation with soldiers, and of a night when 2 broken souls came together to forge a new one. As she spoke, the suburban street outside seemed to fade away, replaced by the scent of wood smoke and the vast, profound silence of the Arizona desert. "You see," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper as she looked into their young, hopeful faces. "It was never about a house, or a piece of land, or a name. It was about something much simpler and much harder. My mother needed safety. My father needed fire. Together, they built a home no war could burn." She let the words settle in the quiet evening air. The story, she knew, was their truest inheritance. It was a map showing them not how to survive in the wilderness, but how to navigate the wilderness of the human heart. Far away, in the quiet, dusty halls of the local history museum, a single object sat in a small glass case. It was a simple turquoise bracelet. Next to it, a small, typewritten card explained that it had been donated by the daughter of Eleanor and Nathan Santos, 2 of the valley's early, respected pioneers. Below the description was a single, unattributed quote, taken from one of Eleanor's old journals, found after her death. "Love is its own territory," the card read, "bound by no borders but those we accept." Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're listening from and to hear your thoughts, so please share them in the comments below to connect with fellow listeners. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales. And like this video, you can support us further by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.